Hi, church. I pray this finds you well. We are in Habakkuk chapter 2 on this episode of Onward. And if you remember chapter 1, we talked about Habakkuk just a little bit. Habakkuk was a minor prophet around about 600 years before Jesus Christ. Prophet during suffering of Judah. And in the book, in chapter 1, Habakkuk basically complains to God and asks the question, why? We wait a little bit, we read on in chapter 1, and then God says, I'm going to amaze you. And then we pick up in chapter 2. If chapter 1 was called the wondering chapter, the why chapter, then chapter 2 is going to be called the waiting chapter. How many of us like waiting? Do you like waiting? I'm not a big fan of waiting. I may not have great patience for waiting. How many of us like waiting for a program on our computer to load when things are just spinning? Or when we're waiting for that text message and we just see the bubbles on the bottom. And I think sometimes people just play with us and they just leave the bubbles there and they don't send it and there's little bubbles. Or how about waiting for a Netflix movie to come up? You're in the middle and it pauses and it needs to refresh. We don't like waiting for that. How about waiting for a meal? Some of us, when we're waiting for a meal, we have that combination of hunger and anger, and we get a little bit hangry when we're waiting for a meal. I have a friend that I'm thinking of right now gets hangry. What about waiting for a prodigal son to come back to Christ, though? A little more serious. Or waiting for that call from the doctor. Those are a little more serious situations. We wait in silly situations and we wait in serious situations. And in Habakkuk, we're going to talk about 3 things that you can do while you are in the waiting, after you've questioned. So I think it's clear that many of us do not like waiting. It's not our favorite thing to do. We need to point out that when we were in the waiting, and many times when we're in the waiting, we are in a hurt situation, or we are not at our best, that we need to listen to God. That's the first thing in chapter 2, verse 1. It says, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what God will say to me. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 1. You see, after the questioning in chapter 1, Habakkuk does not run. He doesn't ask the question why and then take off. He asks the question and then he stays. He doesn't quit. So he doesn't ask the question and then leave. No, he continues. He stays. And that means something. It's not easy to be in a situation when you're questioning and when you're waiting and when you're hurting. We have to be careful in those situations that we're not dictating to God what we think should be happening or what he should be doing. A lot of times we think, well, God, just do this or just do that. It doesn't work quite like that. So chapter 2, verse 1, listening. Listening is key. So I want you to write that down, listening. The next thing that I want to bring up is that period of listening for God to speak. It can take time. And in that time, we need to look at this verse. It is 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9. Paul writes, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. We look to those scriptures when we are in a tough time, that we can understand that even though we're there, Christ is with us. Sometimes we feel that in that waiting period that we're alone because we're not hearing what we think we should be hearing, or we're not listening to what we should be hearing. We're not alone because silence does not equate to absence. Remember that. Silence does not equate to absence. I'm going to move on to the next thing in chapter 2, and that advice is verse 2:2, and it's to write. And it reads like this. Then the Lord replied, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets. How many of you document? How many of you write down? How many of you record thoughts that you have that you believe are from God, words that you have are from God? If you're not doing that, I want to encourage you to do that, especially in times of trial. And especially in times of trial, so that you can look back and you can see what God was speaking to you. Because God is speaking to you a lot of times in those difficult situations But because there's so much going on, Satan steals it. It's just gone. Because Satan wants to take that from you. Remember, it comes to steal, kill, and destroy. If God gives you something, he wants to take that away from you. Because God is speaking. If you are listening, God is speaking. Remember Paul and Silas, when they were in prison, one of the things that they did was that they rejoiced. They rejoiced even before they had an answer that they were freed. They were rejoicing in God. And that rejoicing is very similar to writing things down, because it's putting their faith in front of them and putting action to their faith. So I want to encourage you. First step is to listen. Second step is to write things down. You can buy a journal app. There's free journal apps on your phone, so you can just put them in there when you're doing things. I've started doing that recently, because a lot of times I'll have things that I think are really good, even for Onward. I'll just jot those things down in there, and then I'll revisit them later, and I'll kind of flesh them out, and I'll think about them, and I'll pray about them. But if I don't do that, they come and they go just too quickly for me. The next thing we see in chapter 2 is to wait. And waiting is difficult. It's painful at times, and it can be some of the worst case scenarios that we're waiting through. We could be waiting, like I said earlier, we could be waiting for a prodigal son to return back to Christ, to return back to faith. We could be waiting for healing. We could be waiting for that call from the doctor. We could be waiting to go back to work. We could be waiting for our marriage to be restored. We could be waiting for friendships to be restored. We can be waiting for that forgiveness that we've been holding out for. Chapter 2, verse 3 says this, though. It says, "For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay." And that's Habakkuk 2:3. I want you to remember that God is with us as we listen, as we record things, and as we wait. There are times when we may feel like he's not. Like I said before, silence does not mean absence. So don't give in to that thought. While you're in the stage of maybe hurting and you're not sure what next, and even questioning like Habakkuk was, that not sure what step to take or where to go, take these 3 little things and implement them. And make it a habit to kind of just look at this as a good formula when you're not sure what to do, to listen, to write down, and then to wait. We're going to look at chapter 3 next time, and then it's going to kind of wrap up this little study that we've been doing in the book of Habakkuk. I hope that blesses you, church. I hope it gives you some tools as you move forward. Be blessed. Onward.